If your partner was suddenly gone tomorrow, would you actually know how to survive? How much money would come in each month? How long would your savings last? Would your children really be able to help? Or are they just as scared as you are? Most people think they're prepared for retirement until they're forced to face it alone. Today, we're sharing the quiet story of a woman who lost her husband and discovered a truth about loneliness that almost no one talks about. Margaret Wilson woke up at 6:12 a.m., just like she had for the past 32 years. Her body moved before her mind had time to remember. She reached for the empty side of the bed, expecting the familiar warmth, the quiet rhythm of another person breathing beside her. Her hand touched cold sheets instead. For a moment, she thought she had woken up too early. Or maybe Robert had already gone downstairs. That thought lasted only a second. Then the silence settled in, thick, heavy, unmistakable. Margaret sat up slowly. The house felt larger than it had yesterday. Larger and hollow. In the kitchen, she filled the kettle and placed 2 mugs on the counter out of habit. One blue, one white. Halfway through pouring the water, she froze. There was no reason for 2 anymore. She stared at the extra mug, unsure whether to put it away or leave it there. In the end, she did nothing. The kettle clicked off on its own. This was the morning after her husband died. Before we go any further, comment where in the world you are watching from, and make sure to subscribe because tomorrow's story is one you don't want to miss. Margaret and Robert had been married for 38 years. Not a dramatic love story. No grand gestures. Just years stacked quietly on top of each other. Work, children, bills, routines. The kind of marriage that becomes invisible because it's always there. And now, it wasn't. The funeral had ended 3 days ago. The flowers were still lined up against the living room wall, already beginning to wilt. Sympathy cards sat unopened on the dining table. Margaret told herself she would read them later. Not today. Today felt fragile, like a glass already cracked. She sat at the kitchen table with her coffee growing cold in her hands and realized something frightening. She had no idea what came next. People assume grief looks like tears, like collapsing to the floor, like sobbing into someone else's arms. But for Margaret, grief arrived differently. It arrived as confusion, as unanswered questions, as a quiet panic she couldn't explain to anyone. What bills were due this month? Which bank accounts were in Robert's name? How much money would actually come in now? How long would her savings last? She had never handled those things alone. Robert always said, "We'll be fine." And she believed him. Not because she didn't care, but because that's how their life worked. He took care of the numbers. She took care of everything else. Now, everything else felt meaningless, and the numbers felt terrifying. Margaret glanced at the calendar on the wall. Several days were crossed out in black ink. Doctor appointments. Robert's cardiologist. A reminder to refill medication. All of it useless now. She couldn't bring herself to erase them. The phone rang, cutting through the silence. She jumped, startled by the sound. It was her daughter, Emily. "Mom, are you okay?" Emily asked, trying to sound calm and failing. "I'm fine," Margaret replied automatically. The lie slipped out easily. She had used it for years. They talked briefly. About nothing important. About the weather. About traffic? Then Emily said what Margaret knew was coming. "We should sit down together soon. Talk about Dad's will. And about you. About you." Margaret hung up and stared at the wall for a long time after the call ended. Being discussed. Being planned for. The thought made her chest tighten. She wasn't ready for conversations about selling the house, or moving closer to her children, or whether she could manage on her own. She wasn't even sure what on her own meant yet. All she knew was this: tomorrow morning would come, and the morning after that. And Robert would not be there for any of them. In the days after losing a spouse, many people say the same thing. I don't know what I'm supposed to do now. Not emotionally, practically, financially, existentially. Margaret felt all of it pressing in at once. She stood up from the table and carried one mug to the sink. She hesitated, then washed both. The house was quiet again. And somewhere beneath the fear, beneath the uncertainty, a question formed that she was not yet ready to answer, but one that would shape everything that came next. How do you live when the life you knew is suddenly gone? The days after the funeral blurred together in a way Margaret had never experienced before. Time moved, but it didn't feel real. Morning came. Night fell. Somewhere in between, she ate because she knew she should, not because she was hungry. The house stayed quiet. Not the peaceful kind of quiet, but the kind that pressed against her ears. The refrigerator humming. The clock ticking louder than it ever had. Every sound felt too sharp, too noticeable, because there was nothing else to soften it. Margaret found herself sitting in the living room one afternoon, staring at the chair Robert used to sit in. It still held the faint shape of him, like he might return at any moment. She caught herself listening for his footsteps, even though she knew better. This was when the regret began to surface. It didn't arrive all at once. It came in pieces. She remembered small arguments that seemed insignificant at the time. Complaints about the television being too loud, about the garage being messy, about him spending too much time on hobbies after retirement. She remembered thinking, "We'll talk later." Later never came. After Robert retired, something between them had shifted. He was home all day, unsure of where he fit. She was used to managing the house on her own. Neither of them knew how to talk about it, so they didn't. They lived beside each other, not against each other, just parallel. Margaret stood in the hallway one evening and noticed his jacket still hanging on the hook. She reached out and touched the sleeve. The fabric was stiff, still holding the shape of his arm. Her throat tightened. "I didn't mean to be so hard on you," she whispered into the empty house. Her voice sounded strange, like it didn't belong there. She had thought love meant endurance. Staying, doing what needed to be done. She hadn't realized how much silence had filled the space where words should have been. At night, sleep didn't come easily. Margaret lay awake replaying conversations that never happened. Words she never said. Questions she never asked. Were you happy? Did you feel useless after you retired? Did you know I was just as lost as you were? She assumed she had more time. Everyone does. One afternoon, while sorting through paperwork on the dining table, Margaret came across an old photo album. She hadn't opened it in years. Inside were pictures from early in their marriage, smiling faces, messy hair, cheap furniture, simple happiness. She traced her finger along one photo where Robert had his arm around her, both of them laughing at something long forgotten. "We were good once," she said quietly. And then the guilt hit her harder than before. What if I wasted the time we had left? That question stayed with her, heavy and unrelenting. People came by to check on her, neighbors, friends from church, distant relatives. They asked the same questions. "How are you holding up? Let me know if you need anything." Margaret nodded and thanked them. She smiled when expected. She told them she was managing. But no one asked the question she was drowning in. Who are you now? When Robert was alive, Her role had been clear: wife, partner, the one who made sure everything ran smoothly. Without him, she felt unanchored. One evening, Margaret found herself standing in the kitchen, holding a plate she had just washed. She didn't remember starting the dishes. She didn't remember finishing dinner. She only remembered stopping. Standing there, unsure where to put the plate, unsure why her hands were shaking. She leaned against the counter and closed her eyes. "I should have been kinder," she said softly. Not because she had been cruel, but because kindness, like time, always feels abundant until it suddenly isn't. There were moments when anger crept in, too. Anger at Robert for leaving her alone with all these questions. Anger at herself for not insisting on deeper conversations. Anger at a life that allowed routine to replace intimacy so quietly. Then, the anger faded, leaving only sadness. Margaret realized something painful but true. They had both been afraid. Robert had been afraid of becoming irrelevant after retirement. Afraid of being in the way. Afraid of needing reassurance he didn't know how to ask for. And she had been afraid of slowing down. Afraid of confronting change. Afraid of what would happen if the structure they relied on collapsed. So they avoided the hard conversations. Together. The silence between them hadn't been neglect. It had been uncertainty. Understanding that didn't erase the regret, but it softened it. One night, as she lay in bed staring at the ceiling, Margaret spoke again into the darkness. "I didn't know how to do it better," she said. "But I loved you." The words didn't bring closure. They didn't fix anything. But they mattered. Because love, she realized too late, doesn't disappear just because it wasn't perfectly expressed. Still, the question remained. If her life with Robert was over, and there was no rewriting it, then what was left? She wasn't ready to answer that yet. All she knew was that the silence she lived with now was different from the silence she had shared before. One was chosen. This one wasn't. And somewhere deep inside, beneath the grief and the regret, a quiet understanding began to take shape. She could carry the love forward, or let the silence consume her. For now, she simply sat with it, with the memories, with the words left unsaid. Tomorrow would come again, and she would still be here. It was late afternoon when the doorbell rang. Margaret wasn't expecting anyone. Most people had already come by in the days after the funeral. The casseroles were gone. The sympathy cards were stacked neatly in a drawer she hadn't opened since. The world, it seemed, was already beginning to move on. She hesitated before answering the door. On the porch stood a man she recognized, though it took her a moment to place him. He was taller than she remembered, his hair more gray than in the photos in Robert's old fishing album. "Mrs. Wilson?" he asked gently. "Yes," Margaret replied. "My name is Daniel Harris. I was a friend of Robert's. We used to go fishing together." Something in her chest tightened. She nodded and stepped aside, allowing him in. Daniel held a long, weathered fishing rod in his hands. The cork grip was worn smooth, the reel scratched and faded. "I borrowed this from Robert a while back," he said. "Didn't get the chance to return it." Margaret took the rod carefully, as if it might break if she held it too tightly. "He talked about fishing a lot," she said. It was one of the few things that still excited him. Daniel smiled faintly. "Yeah, it was more than fishing, though. It was where he went to think." Margaret gestured for him to sit. They settled into the living room, the same room that had felt unbearably quiet just hours before. Now, the silence shifted, no longer empty, but heavy with something waiting to be said. "I hope it's okay that I stopped by," Daniel said. I just felt like there were things you should know. Margaret's hands folded tightly in her lap. Please, she said. I'd like that. Daniel leaned forward slightly, resting his elbows on his knees. I've known Robert for over 30 years, he began. We worked together before he retired. And after that, we'd meet early mornings, talk about life. He talked about you a lot. Margaret blinked, surprised. He did? All the time? She looked down, unsure how to respond. He used to say he worried he was in your way after retirement, Daniel continued. Said you'd been running the house just fine without him for years, and suddenly he didn't know where he fit anymore. Margaret felt her throat tighten. The words struck something tender. I thought he liked being busy with his hobbies, she said quietly. I thought that's what he wanted. He did, Daniel said. But not because he wanted to avoid you. Margaret's fingers curled inward. He told me once, Daniel said slowly, choosing his words with care. I don't want to become a burden. Margaret's done so much for me. I don't want to make her life harder. Margaret's breath caught. She hadn't expected that. I thought he was pulling away, she whispered. I thought he didn't want to talk anymore. Daniel shook his head gently. He just didn't know how to say what he was feeling. He wasn't good with words. You know that. She nodded. She did know that. Too well. Daniel paused, then continued. There's something else he said. Something I think matters now more than ever. Margaret looked up at him, her eyes searching his face. Not long before he passed, Daniel said, we were driving back from a fishing trip. He was quiet most of the ride. Then, out of nowhere, he said, if anything ever happens to me, I hope Margaret knows this. She's stronger than she thinks. Smarter than she gives herself credit for. Margaret felt a sudden warmth rush to her face, followed by tears she hadn't allowed herself to shed until now. He said, Daniel went on, if I go first, the house, the money, all of it, she should decide. She knows what's best, better than I ever could. The room seemed to tilt slightly. Margaret gripped the arm of her chair. Her hands trembled. He trusted you, Daniel said softly. Completely. For a long moment, Margaret couldn't speak. She had spent days replaying her own regrets, the sharp words, the impatience, the silence. She had assumed Robert had died with the same distance between them that had existed at the end. She had been wrong. I never knew, she said finally, her voice barely audible. I thought he felt pushed aside. Daniel looked at her with quiet certainty. He felt unsure, he said, but never unloved, and never resentful. Margaret covered her mouth with her hand, overwhelmed by the weight of it all, the grief, the relief, the sorrow of learning too late. I wish he'd told me, she said. I think he tried, Daniel replied, in the only ways he knew how. They sat together in silence after that. Not the painful silence Margaret had grown used to, but a gentler one, a shared stillness. Daniel stood to leave after a while. I'm glad I came, he said. And if you ever need anything, or if you just want to talk to someone who knew him, I'm here. Thank you, Margaret said, for telling me, for all of it. After he left, Margaret remained in the living room, the fishing rod resting across her lap. She ran her fingers over the worn grip, imagining Robert's hands there, steady and familiar. She closed her eyes. So that's what you thought of me, she whispered. The regret didn't vanish. It never would. But something shifted inside her. She hadn't failed him the way she believed she had. He had trusted her. That knowledge didn't erase the pain of his absence, but it changed the way she carried it. For the first time since his death, Margaret felt something other than fear about the future. Not confidence, not certainty, but permission. Permission to decide, permission to move forward, permission to believe that she was capable, because someone she loved had believed it first. She placed the fishing rod gently against the wall. Tomorrow, she knew, would still be difficult, but now she would face it differently. Not as a woman abandoned by circumstance, but as someone who had been trusted, even in silence. The Social Security office was quieter than Margaret expected. No long lines, no chaos, just a row of plastic chairs, muted beige walls, and a low television playing a daytime news program that no one was watching. Everyone there sat with the same posture, shoulders slightly hunched, eyes fixed forward, as if bracing themselves for something they couldn't yet name. Margaret clutched the folder in her hands. Inside were copies of Robert's death certificate, their marriage license, tax returns, and forms she didn't fully understand. She had triple-checked everything the night before, afraid that missing one piece of paper would somehow unravel the rest of her life. When her number was called, she stood up slowly, her knees stiff. The woman behind the desk spoke kindly. Not warm, not cold, just practiced. She explained survivor benefits, retirement benefits, eligibility, calculations based on work history, contributions, age. Margaret nodded along, pretending she understood more than she did. Then the woman turned the computer screen slightly and said, "Based on your husband's record and your own, this is what you can expect monthly." Margaret leaned forward. The number sat there quietly. 1,512. That was it. Not a range. Not an estimate that could stretch with optimism. Just a number, neat, exact, unfeeling. Margaret blinked. That's everything?" she asked. "That would be your total monthly benefit," the woman confirmed gently. "Before taxes." Margaret felt the air leave her chest. She had known it wouldn't be much. Everyone had told her that. Friends, neighbors, even her daughter had warned her to be realistic. Still, seeing it written down changed something. A number doesn't care about fear, or grief, or how long a marriage lasted. It just exists. Margaret thanked the woman, gathered her papers, and walked out into the parking lot. The afternoon sun was brighter than she expected. Cars passed by. People went about their lives. She sat in her car and didn't start the engine. Instead, she pulled out a small notebook from her purse, one she'd used for grocery lists and reminders, and began to write. Property tax, $3,200 a year. Heating in winter, unpredictable. Electric, water, trash, groceries, gas, car insurance, prescription co-pays. The list grew longer. She added it up slowly, carefully, like the act itself might soften the truth. It didn't. The math was simple. Her income barely matched her expenses, and that was assuming nothing went wrong. No broken appliances, no medical emergencies, no unexpected repairs, no life. Margaret rested her forehead against the steering wheel. She wasn't irresponsible. She wasn't reckless. She hadn't lived extravagantly. She had done everything the way she was supposed to. And still, the margin was gone. The realization hit her with a quiet cruelty. Surviving was possible. Living comfortably was not. That night, back at home, she walked through the house differently. She noticed things she had ignored for years. The faint crack in the ceiling near the staircase. The washing machine that rattled too loudly. The fence in the backyard leaning just slightly more than it used to. All of it cost money. Money she didn't have. She sat at the kitchen table again, the same spot where she had once planned vacations, birthday dinners, school schedules. Now she spread out bills instead. She read them carefully, as if reading them differently might change their meaning. They didn't. Margaret thought about the house Robert had loved, the house where they had raised their children, the house that held every version of their life together. She also thought about the stairs, the long driveway, the winters that grew harder every year. She understood why her children were worried. For the first time, she didn't dismiss their concerns as overprotective. She picked up the phone, then set it back down. She wasn't ready to talk yet. Later that evening, she heated up leftovers she barely tasted. She sat alone at the table, the television on for noise rather than interest. A commercial came on, something about retirement planning. She laughed once, sharply. Too late for that. Margaret didn't cry that night. She slept. Not deeply, but enough. And in the morning, she did something she hadn't expected. She opened her laptop. It took her a while to remember the password. She typed slowly, carefully, as if afraid of making a mistake. When the screen finally lit up, she stared at it for a long moment. Then she opened a job search website. She didn't apply to anything yet. She just looked. Part-time, flexible hours, no heavy lifting preferred. She felt embarrassed, not because of the work, but because of the necessity. She had imagined this stage of life differently. Quieter, safer, earned. But the numbers had spoken, and numbers, she now understood, don't negotiate. Margaret closed the laptop and made herself a cup of coffee. 1 cup. She sat by the window and watched the morning light spill across the floor. She was still afraid, but fear had changed shape. It was no longer a vague cloud hanging over her future. It was a clear, defined problem, one she could look at, measure, and begin to address. She didn't know yet how she would solve it, but for the first time since Robert died, she knew exactly what she was up against. And sometimes, knowing the truth, no matter how hard, is the first step toward standing on your own feet again. Sunday afternoon arrived with the kind of forced calm that Margaret recognized immediately. The house was cleaner than usual. The cushions on the couch were straightened. The kitchen table was cleared except for a folder neatly placed in the center. Inside were documents she still didn't fully understand: wills, statements, printouts from the Social Security office. Her children arrived within minutes of each other. Emily came first, carrying a small bag of groceries, even though Margaret had told her not to. Her son, David, followed shortly after, removing his shoes at the door like he used to when he was young. They hugged her carefully. Not too tight, not too long, as if she were fragile glass. "How are you holding up, Mom?" Emily asked. Margaret smiled, the same practice smile she had been using for weeks. "I'm managing," she said. They sat around the table. For a moment, no one spoke. The hum of the refrigerator filled the silence. David cleared his throat. "So, Mom, you said you went to the Social Security office." "Yes," Margaret replied. "I did." "And?" Emily asked gently. Margaret took a breath. "With everything combined, it'll be about $1,500 a month." Neither of her children reacted right away. They exchanged a glance, quick, subtle, but loaded with meaning. Emily was the first to speak. "Okay, that helps to know." David leaned back in his chair, arms crossed. "Mom, can I ask something? Just honestly." Margaret nodded. "Have you really thought about whether you can stay here by yourself long term?" There it was. Margaret had known the question was coming. Still, it landed heavily. "This house is old," David continued, his voice careful. "The stairs are steep. The winters are rough. And if something happened to you—" "I know," Margaret interrupted softly. "I've thought about that." Emily leaned forward. "We're not trying to pressure you," she said quickly. "We're just worried. You'd be closer to us if you moved. Safer." Margaret looked down at the table. This house was more than wood and walls. It was where Robert had fixed the leaky sink with his own hands, where the children had marked their heights on the doorframe, where life had unfolded slowly, imperfectly, but fully. "I understand why you're worried," Margaret said. "I really do." "But?" David asked. "But this is still my home." Emily sighed. "Mom, no one is saying you have to decide today. But selling the house, moving into a smaller place, it might make things easier financially too." Margaret felt something tighten inside her chest. So now it was about money. Not greed. She knew that. But necessity has a way of sounding cold, even when it's wrapped in concern. "I'm not asking to be reckless," Margaret said. "I'm not ignoring reality. I need to feel like I still get a say in my own life." The room fell quiet. David rubbed his forehead. "That's not what we're trying to take away." "Then what is it?" Margaret asked quietly. Emily's voice softened. "Mom, we're scared." Margaret looked up. "We're scared that you'll fall," Emily continued. "That you'll get sick and no one will know. That we'll get a phone call in the middle of the night and it'll be too late." The words landed differently than the others. Not as pressure, as fear. Margaret exhaled slowly. "I don't want to be a burden," she said. "You're not," David said immediately. "But that's what it feels like," Margaret replied. "Ever since your father died, it feels like I've become a problem to solve." Emily reached across the table and took her mother's hand. "You're not a problem. You're our mom." Margaret squeezed her hand back. "I hear you," she said. "And I promise I won't make decisions with my eyes closed. I'll talk to professionals. I'll plan. I'll adjust if I need to." She paused. "But I need to make the final call myself." David nodded slowly. "That's fair." Emily hesitated, then nodded too. "Okay. We can agree on that." Relief washed through Margaret, not because everything was resolved, but because something important had been acknowledged. Her independence. They spent the rest of the afternoon going through paperwork together. Calmly, carefully. Talking about practical things, emergency contacts, medical directives, who to call if something broke. No one raised their voice. No one stormed out. Still, when they left, Margaret felt exhausted. She stood in the doorway and watched their cars pull away, one by one. The house returned to its familiar quiet. Margaret sat back down at the kitchen table, alone again. But the silence felt different this time. Heavier, yet clearer. She realized something as she gathered the papers back into their folder. Love doesn't always sound gentle. Sometimes, love sounds like worry, like uncomfortable questions, like pressure that comes from not knowing how to protect someone you care about. Her children weren't trying to control her life. They were trying to keep her in it. Margaret stood up and walked slowly through the house, touching the walls, the furniture, the places where memory lingered. She wasn't ready to leave, but she also wasn't pretending things wouldn't change. For the first time, she felt like the decisions ahead weren't being forced upon her, but placed in her hands. And that made all the difference. Margaret stood in front of the bathroom mirror longer than she meant to. She had already changed her blouse twice. The first felt too formal. The second too casual. She settled on a plain navy one, clean, simple, safe. She brushed her hair carefully, the same way she used to before parent-teacher meetings years ago, back when she still felt certain about her place in the world. Now, that certainty was gone. At 62, she hadn't filled out a job application in more than 3 decades. The last time she worked outside the home, her children were still in elementary school. Back then, she'd left her job without much thought. Everyone said she could always go back if she needed to. She never imagined needing to would come like this. The grocery store parking lot was half full when she arrived. Margaret sat in her car for a moment, hands resting on the steering wheel, heart beating faster than it should have. She watched people walk in and out, younger, faster, confident in ways she no longer felt. What am I doing here? She wondered. She took a deep breath and stepped out of the car. Inside, the store smelled faintly of bread and cleaning solution. A manager with a friendly but tired face greeted her and led her to a small office near the back. "Thanks for coming in, Margaret," he said, glancing at her application. "Why don't you tell me a little about yourself?" She hesitated. The truth felt too heavy, too personal. But she decided to be honest anyway. "My husband passed away recently," she said quietly. "I need to support myself now. And I want a reason to get up in the morning." The manager didn't rush her. He nodded slowly. "I'm sorry for your loss," he said. "That can't be easy." Margaret nodded, grateful he didn't say anything more. He flipped through her application. "It looks like you've been out of the workforce a long time." "Yes," she replied. "I stayed home with my kids, took care of the house, my family." "That kind of experience doesn't disappear," he said. "It just doesn't always get written down." She hadn't expected that. "What about the physical part of the job?" He continued. "Some lifting, standing for a few hours at a time." Margaret straightened her shoulders. "I won't pretend it won't be an adjustment, but I'm willing to learn. And I'm careful." He studied her for a moment, then smiled. "We're short-handed," he said. "A lot of people are. We could start you part-time. 2 mornings a week. Stocking shelves at first." Her chest tightened, not with excitement, but with relief. "I can do mornings," she said quickly. "Actually, mornings are better." "How so?" he asked. Margaret paused, then answered honestly. "When I'm home alone in the morning," she said, "that's when it's hardest." The manager nodded, understanding more than she had expected. "All right," he said. "Let's give it a try. No pressure. If it's too much, we adjust." She thanked him. Several times. When she walked back out into the store, the fluorescent lights felt brighter than before. She passed aisles she would soon be responsible for. Cereal boxes stacked neatly, canned goods lined up in perfect rows. She felt small, but she also felt needed. Her first day came sooner than she expected. Margaret woke before dawn, nerves buzzing under her skin. She made coffee, 1 cup, and sat at the kitchen table, staring at the clock until it was time to leave. At the store, everything moved faster than she anticipated. Her hands fumbled with price tags. She bent down too quickly once and felt a sharp reminder in her lower back. A younger coworker showed her how to scan items properly when she forgot the sequence. "I'm sorry," Margaret said more than once. "Don't worry about it," they replied. Everyone messes up at first. By the end of her shift, her feet ached. Her shoulders were stiff. She drove home in silence, exhaustion settling into her bones. But something else came with it. Purpose, The next morning, she woke up sore but alert. She knew where she needed to be, what time she had to leave, what clothes to put on. There was comfort in that. Work didn't erase the loneliness. It didn't solve the financial problem entirely. It didn't make her grief disappear, but it gave shape to her days. And for now, that was enough. Margaret realized something as she set her alarm for the next shift. She wasn't working because she had failed at retirement. She was working because life had changed, and she was changing with it. At 62, she wasn't starting over. She was continuing. And that, she decided as she turned off the light, took a quiet kind of courage. For a while, work distracted Margaret. Her days had structure now. Alarm, coffee, drive, shelves, labels, short conversations that stayed safely on the surface. She learned the rhythm of the store, when it was quiet, when it was rushed, which aisles customers always asked about. On the outside, it looked like progress. On the inside, something still felt unfinished. It usually crept in during the evenings. Margaret would come home, kick off her shoes, and stand in the kitchen unsure of what to do next. Dinner, for one, felt strangely heavy. She cooked less, choosing simple meals she could eat without thinking. Sometimes she didn't bother sitting at the table at all. The house was still too quiet. Work had given her something to do, but it hadn't answered the question that returned every night, softer but more persistent than before. What am I doing all this for? One Thursday afternoon, after finishing her shift, Margaret sat in her car longer than usual. She didn't turn the key. She just sat there, hands resting in her lap, staring at nothing. She felt tired, not the physical kind. The tiredness that comes from carrying yourself through the day without knowing why. She drove, almost without realizing where she was going, until she found herself parked outside the local community center. A sign near the entrance read, "Grief Support, Thursdays, 4:30 p.m. She had seen the sign before, always told herself she didn't need it. Today, she wasn't so sure. Inside, the room was small and plain. Folding chairs arranged in a loose circle. A few people already seated, mostly older, some with eyes that looked too familiar. A woman introduced herself as Linda, the facilitator. Her voice was calm, unhurried. "No pressure to speak," she said. "You can just listen." Margaret chose a chair near the door. One by one, people shared pieces of their stories. A man who lost his wife after 50 years. A woman whose husband had died suddenly, leaving her with debts she didn't understand. Different details. Same hollow tone. When it was Margaret's turn, she hesitated. "I'm Margaret," she said finally. "My husband died a few months ago." She stopped there. Linda nodded gently. "What's been hardest lately?" Margaret thought about the number at the Social Security office, about the job, about the empty house. "I'm doing what I'm supposed to do," she said slowly. "I got a job. I pay my bills. I keep going." Her voice wavered. "But I don't know who I'm doing it for anymore." The words surprised her as they left her mouth. Silence followed, not uncomfortable, but attentive. Linda leaned forward slightly. "Can I ask you something, Margaret?" Margaret nodded. "When you woke up this morning," Linda asked, "what made you get out of bed?" Margaret frowned. "Because I had work." "And before work?" Linda asked. Margaret thought. "I ate breakfast." "Why?" Linda asked gently. "Because I needed the energy." Linda smiled softly. "So, you took care of your body." Margaret blinked. Linda continued. And you went to work to support yourself. And you came here because something inside you said, I need help. She paused. Those are all reasons. Margaret felt something loosen in her chest. I always lived for someone else, Margaret said quietly. First my kids, then my husband. Now they all have their own lives. And I feel selfish even thinking about myself. Linda shook her head. Taking responsibility for your own life isn't selfish. It's necessary. Margaret looked down at her hands. I don't feel useful, she admitted. I stock shelves. That's it. Linda met her gaze. Do people find what they need because of you? Margaret hesitated. Yes. Then you're useful, Linda said simply. The room was quiet again. Linda spoke once more. Sometimes, after loss, people think they need to find a big new purpose, a reason that makes everything make sense. She smiled gently. But most of the time, purpose doesn't arrive all at once. It shows up quietly, in small decisions, in taking care of yourself, in being present. Margaret felt tears sting her eyes. So I don't need to know the answer yet? She asked. No, Linda replied. You just need to stay. That night, Margaret drove home differently. She stopped at the grocery store, not the one she worked at, and bought a small slice of cake. Chocolate. Something she rarely chose. At home, she set it on a plate and sat at the table. She ate slowly, not because it tasted extraordinary, but because she allowed herself to enjoy it. For the first time in a long while, Margaret didn't rush through the evening. She didn't fill the silence with television noise. She didn't distract herself with busy work. She simply existed. And that was enough. Later, lying in bed, Margaret thought about the question that had haunted her. What am I living for? She didn't have a clear answer, but she realized something important. She was still here, still waking up, still choosing, still caring for herself in small, quiet ways. Maybe meaning wasn't something she had to chase. Maybe it was something that followed, slowly. Once she stopped running from her own life, Margaret turned off the light. Tomorrow would come again. And this time, she wouldn't be afraid of the question. She would let the answer take its time. Spring arrived without asking for permission. Margaret noticed it one morning when she opened the front door and felt warm air brush against her face. The tree in the front yard, bare for months, had begun to show small green leaves. She stood there longer than necessary, hand resting on the doorframe, letting herself notice it. Life had not changed dramatically. There were no sudden breakthroughs, no moment where everything finally made sense. But something inside her had shifted. Margaret still worked at the grocery store 2 mornings a week. Her body had adjusted to the routine. She learned which boxes were heavier than they looked, which shelves required a step stool, which coworkers liked to talk and which preferred silence. She was no longer the slowest one. Customers began to recognize her. Good morning, they'd say. You always keep this aisle so neat. Small comments. Easy to overlook. But she carried them home with her, storing them somewhere quiet inside. At home, the house was still quiet, but it no longer felt empty in the same way. Margaret had stopped turning on the television just for noise. Instead, she played soft music while cooking. She cooked more than she had in months. Nothing elaborate. Soups, simple pastas, meals that filled the kitchen with warmth. She ate at the table, sometimes alone, sometimes with a book open beside her plate. She still missed Robert. That hadn't changed. There were moments when grief returned without warning, when she passed his favorite chair, or found an old receipt in his jacket pocket, or reached for her phone instinctively, forgetting there was no one to call anymore. But the grief no longer felt like it would swallow her whole. It sat beside her now. One afternoon, Margaret drove to the cemetery. She hadn't planned to. The decision came quietly, halfway through the drive, like a thought she didn't resist. She stood in front of the headstone for a long time. "I'm doing okay," she said aloud. Not because she needed to say it, but because it felt true enough to speak. She told him about the job, about the sore feet that had finally stopped hurting, about the cake she'd eaten that one night and how she didn't feel guilty about it anymore. "I'm learning," she said. Slowly. The wind moved through the trees above her. Margaret didn't wait for a sign. She didn't need one. At home, she began making small changes. She installed brighter lights near the stairs, added railings in the bathroom. Practical things, sensible things. Not because her children insisted, but because she wanted to take care of herself. She spoke to her kids regularly. Not long calls, just check-ins. "I'm fine," she'd tell them. And this time, she meant it. They stopped sounding worried all the time. One evening, Margaret sat by the window as the sun dipped low, casting long shadows across the floor. She held a mug of tea, chamomile, something she'd never liked before but found comforting now. She thought about the question that had once terrified her. What am I living for? The answer still wasn't clear, and she realized, gently, without panic, that it didn't need to be. She was living because she woke up, because her body still needed care, because there were people who expected to see her, even briefly, because there were moments, small and ordinary, that felt quietly worth staying for. Margaret understood something she hadn't before. Meaning didn't arrive first. Living did. Meaning followed, slowly, unevenly, in its own time. One morning, Margaret woke at 6:12 a.m. Out of habit, she reached for the empty side of the bed. She paused. Then she sat up, feet touching the floor, and stood. In the kitchen, she filled the kettle and placed one mug on the counter. Just one. She watched the steam rise as the water heated, listened to the familiar click when it finished. She poured the water carefully, added tea, and carried the mug to the table. Outside, the neighborhood was waking up. A car engine started. A dog barked somewhere down the street. Margaret sipped her tea. In an hour, she would get dressed for work. Later, she might stop by the library, or take a walk, or call someone she hadn't spoken to in a while. Nothing remarkable, nothing dramatic, just a life. Continuing. Margaret no longer waited for the loneliness to disappear. She knew it wouldn't. Instead, she learned how to walk with it, to carry it without letting it define her. She wasn't brave in the way people talked about bravery. She didn't feel strong all the time, but she showed up every day, and that, she had learned, was enough. Because sometimes, the most meaningful thing a person can do after loss isn't starting over. It's staying quietly, one morning at a time. Losing a partner later in life doesn't just break your heart. It quietly dismantles the structure of your entire world. For decades, many people don't live for themselves. They live for a spouse, for children, for responsibility. And when that role disappears, what's left isn't just grief, it's confusion. Financial systems aren't designed for single seniors. Pensions often fall short. Savings disappear faster than expected. And returning to work after 60 can feel humiliating, frightening, or simply impossible. But perhaps the hardest loss isn't money. It's identity. So many widows and widowers ask the same question in silence. Who am I living for now? This story isn't about finding a grand purpose. It's about something far more realistic and far more human. Learning that survival doesn't require answers right away. You don't need to know what the rest of your life is for. You only need a reason to get through today. A reason to wake up, to eat, to move, to speak to someone. Purpose doesn't come first. Living does. And meaning, slowly, quietly, follows behind. If you or someone you love is facing retirement, widowhood, or aging alone, remember this. You are not weak for feeling lost. You are not selfish for choosing yourself. And you are not behind. You're still here. And that matters more than you think. If this story resonated with you, please take a moment to like this video. It helps more people find stories that matter. We'd also love to hear from you. If you were over 60 and suddenly had to face life alone, what would worry you the most? Money? Loneliness? Your health? Or simply not knowing what comes next? Share your thoughts in the comments. You're not the only one asking these questions. And if you want more real, honest stories about aging, family, loss, and finding meaning in ordinary days, make sure to subscribe to the channel.